Have you ever been trapped in a nightmare where the people who were supposed to love you the most became the architects of your deepest pain? Have you ever wondered what it takes to stand up against an entire family, to expose the truth they've been hiding for years, to face them in a courtroom and demand justice? Well, let me tell you exactly what happened to me, because until that lawyer asked one single question that shattered their carefully constructed lies, I thought I would never see them admit to what they did. My name doesn't matter, but my story does. Because it's the story of survival, of finding my voice when everyone tried to silence me, and of that one incredible moment when truth finally pierced through years of deception. I was 24 years old when I sat in that courtroom, my hands trembling so violently I had to clasp them together in my lap, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on me. The wooden bench beneath me felt impossibly hard, and I could smell the distinct scent of old books and furniture polish that seemed to permeate every corner of the building. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that I was convinced everyone could hear it. This wild drumbeat of fear and hope and rage all mixed together into something I couldn't name. Across the aisle, separated by what felt like both everything and nothing at all, sat my family. My mother, dressed impeccably in a navy blue suit that probably cost more than I'd spent on rent in 6 months, her perfectly styled hair not a strand out of place, her face a mask of wounded dignity. My father beside her, his jaw set in that way I remembered so well, that expression that said he was the one being wronged, that this was all some terrible misunderstanding, some betrayal by an ungrateful child. And my brother, sitting behind them, refusing to even look in my direction, as if I were a ghost, someone who had ceased to exist the moment I dared to speak the truth. I want you to understand something right now, before I take you through everything that happened. This wasn't easy. Nothing about what I'm going to tell you was easy. Every single step of this journey required me to dig deeper than I thought possible, to find strength I didn't know I had, to face memories I had buried so deep I had almost convinced myself they weren't real. But they were real. Every moment of cruelty, every calculated punishment disguised as discipline, every time they looked at me with eyes that held contempt instead of love, it was all devastatingly, painfully real. Growing up in that house was like living in a beautiful prison, where the bars were made of expectations and control, where love was conditional and always just out of reach, dangled in front of me like a carrot I could never quite grasp. From the outside, we were perfect. We were the family everyone admired. We lived in a gorgeous house in a neighborhood where every lawn was manicured and every car was expensive. My parents were respected in the community. My mother volunteered at the local hospital and organized charity events. My father was a successful businessman, the kind of man people looked up to, whose opinion mattered, who could walk into a room and command respect with just his presence. And me? I was supposed to be the perfect daughter, the one who smiled at all the right times, who got good grades, who never caused problems, who made them look good. But behind closed doors, behind the facade they so carefully maintained, something else was happening. Something dark and twisted and wrong. The abuse didn't start with violence, at least not the kind you could see. It started with words, with looks, with silence that felt like punishment. It started when I was just 7 years old, and I accidentally spilled juice on the carpet. My mother didn't yell. She just looked at me with this expression of pure disgust and said nothing for 3 days. 3 days of being invisible, of not existing in my own home. That was when I learned that their love came with conditions, that I had to earn my place in that family every single day, and that one mistake could cost me everything. As I got older, the cruelty evolved. It became more sophisticated, more calculated. They knew exactly where to hurt me, exactly what would leave the deepest scars, even if those scars were invisible to everyone else. They controlled everything, what I wore, who I spoke to, what I ate, when I could leave my room. They had reasons for everything, explanations that sounded almost reasonable if you didn't look too closely. They were just protecting me, just teaching me discipline, just preparing me for the real world. But the real world doesn't lock you in a dark basement for hours because you forgot to do a chore. The real world doesn't tell you that you're worthless, that you're a burden, that everyone would be better off without you. The real world doesn't make you feel like you have to be perfect just to deserve basic human kindness. I learned to be invisible. I learned to anticipate their moods, to read the slightest shift in their expressions, to make myself small and quiet and unnoticeable. I became an expert at surviving, at navigating the minefield that was my own home. I studied hard because good grades meant fewer problems. I did everything they asked, no matter how unreasonable, because obedience meant safety, or at least the closest thing to safety I could find. I stopped inviting friends over after my mother humiliated me in front of a classmate when I was 12, telling her in excruciating detail about all my failures and flaws, laughing as she did it, as if it were all just a funny story. I stopped trying to connect with them emotionally after realizing that every vulnerability I showed would be weaponized against me later. I built walls around my heart so high and so thick that sometimes I wondered if there was anything left inside them. The physical abuse started when I was 14. I had started to develop my own opinions, my own personality, and that terrified them. Control was slipping from their grasp, and they couldn't allow that. It started small, a slap here, a shove there, always where bruises wouldn't show, always with a justification, always followed by their version of an apology that somehow made it clear it was my fault. I had provoked them. I had been disrespectful. I had left them no choice. And I believed them. That's the most insidious part of this kind of abuse. I actually believed that I deserved it, that I was the problem, that if I could just be better, do better, they would love me the way I so desperately needed to be loved. I carried that belief like a stone in my chest for years, letting it weigh me down, letting it define who I was and what I thought I deserved. Have you ever felt like you're drowning, but everyone around you insists you're fine, that you're being dramatic, that you're imagining things? That was my entire childhood, my entire adolescence. And the worst part was that I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, because they had isolated me so completely. They had convinced everyone who might have helped that I was troubled, that I was difficult, that I had problems. They had rewritten the narrative so thoroughly that even I sometimes doubted my own reality. The years passed in this strange, suffocating routine, and I learned to survive by becoming whoever they needed me to be in each moment. I was a chameleon, constantly shifting and adapting, never quite sure who I really was beneath all the masks I wore. School became my refuge, the only place where I could breathe a little easier, though even there I felt the weight of their expectations crushing down on me. Every test, every assignment, every interaction was another opportunity to fail them, and failure was never an option in our house. I remember sitting in my room late at night, doing homework by the small lamp on my desk, hearing them downstairs laughing and talking like a normal family, and feeling this profound sense of exclusion, of not belonging in my own life. They could be warm and loving with each other, I saw it. But with me, it was different. With me, there was always this edge, this underlying current of disappointment and disdain. My brother learned early on that aligning with them meant safety, and so he did. He became another enforcer of their rules, another person I had to fear and avoid. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest part of it all, because even within my own family, I was utterly alone. I developed anxiety that sat in my chest like a living thing, always there, always waiting to spike into panic at the slightest provocation. I learned to recognize the sound of my father's car in the driveway, and the specific way my mother's heels clicked on the hardwood floor, and my body would tense automatically, preparing for whatever was coming. Sleep became difficult because nightmares plagued me, and even in my dreams I couldn't escape them. I would wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, and have to remind myself to breathe, to calm down, that I had survived another day, and could survive the next. The punishments became more severe as I got older. They knew I was counting down the days until I could leave, until I turned 18 and could escape, and they seemed determined to break me before that could happen. They told me I would never make it on my own, that I was too weak, too stupid, too damaged. They told me that no one else would ever want me, ever love me, that I should be grateful they tolerated my presence at all. And part of me believed them, even as another part of me was screaming that this wasn't normal, that this wasn't love, that I deserved better. I started keeping a journal, hiding it in a loose floorboard under my bed, documenting everything that happened. I didn't know why I was doing it at first. Maybe it was just to have proof that I wasn't crazy, that these things were really happening. Maybe it was to have something that validated my reality when they tried to gaslight me into believing I was imagining things or exaggerating or being too sensitive. Those pages became my lifeline, the only place where I could be honest, where I could acknowledge the full extent of what was happening without fear of retribution. I wrote about the time my mother locked me out of the house in winter because I had come home 10 minutes late from the library, how I sat on the porch shivering for 3 hours before she finally let me in, saying nothing, acting as if it had never happened. I wrote about the time my father grabbed me by the throat and slammed me against the wall because I had questioned one of his decisions, how my brother watched and did nothing, how they all acted completely normal at breakfast the next morning. I wrote about the constant criticism, the way nothing I did was ever good enough, the way they could make me feel smaller than an insect with just a look or a comment. I wrote about the loneliness, the bone-deep exhaustion of always being on guard, the way I had started to feel like I was disappearing, like I was becoming less real with each passing day. When I finally turned 18, I had a plan. I had been saving every bit of money I could get my hands on. Birthday money from relatives, money from a part-time job I had convinced them to let me take, hiding it in that same space under my floorboard. I had researched shelters, read everything I could about what I would need to survive on my own, prepared as much as I could without raising suspicion. The day I left was both the most terrifying and the most liberating day of my life. I waited until they were all out of the house, packed a single backpack with essentials, took my journal and my small stash of money, and walked out the front door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the doorknob. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. Every step away from that house felt monumental, like I was walking through concrete, like my body was fighting against what my mind knew I had to do. I kept expecting them to appear, to stop me, to drag me back, but they didn't. I just walked, one foot in front of the other, until I couldn't see the house anymore, and then I kept walking. I ended up at a youth shelter that first night, lying on a narrow cot in a room with 3 other girls, and for the first time in years, I felt something that resembled peace. It wasn't much, that shelter. The food was institutional and bland, the rooms were crowded, the bathrooms were shared and not particularly clean, but it was mine in a way that house had never been. No one there was monitoring my every move, punishing me for existing, making me feel like I had to earn my right to take up space. The relief was so intense it made me cry. These huge, racking sobs that I muffled in my thin pillow so I wouldn't disturb the other girls. I had escaped. I was free. But freedom, I quickly learned, came with its own set of challenges that I hadn't fully anticipated, despite all my planning. The real world was harder than I had imagined, and I had imagined it would be pretty hard. Finding a job was difficult because I had minimal work experience and no permanent address. Finding housing was even harder because I had no credit history, no references, no safety net. I couch surfed for a while, staying with people I barely knew, always aware that I was one bad interaction away from being back on the street. I worked multiple part-time jobs, whatever I could find, retail, fast food, cleaning offices at night, barely scraping together enough for food, and the cheapest room I could rent in a house with 5 other people. I was exhausted constantly, running on adrenaline and coffee and sheer stubborn determination not to go back, not to let them win, not to prove them right about my inability to survive without them. Those first few years on my own were a blur of struggle and survival. I enrolled in community college, taking classes when I could afford them, slowly working toward a degree that I hoped would lead to something better. I made friends, real friends, for the first time in my life, people who saw me for who I was and liked me anyway, people who didn't expect me to be perfect or punish me for being human. I started therapy with a counselor at the college who offered sliding scale rates, and that was when I really began to understand what had been done to me, to put names to the experiences I had lived through. Words like abuse, trauma, gaslighting, emotional manipulation, hearing these terms applied to my life was both validating and devastating. It meant I hadn't been crazy or too sensitive or dramatic. It meant what happened to me was real and wrong and not my fault. But it also meant processing years of pain that I had pushed down and ignored in order to survive. And that process was excruciating in ways I hadn't expected. My therapist was the one who first suggested that I might want to consider taking legal action against my family. The idea seemed absurd at first. Impossible. Who was I to challenge them? They had money, connections, respect in the community. I was nobody. A college dropout working minimum wage jobs, living paycheck to paycheck, barely keeping my head above water. What chance did I have against them? But she kept gently pushing the idea, reminding me that I had documentation in my journal, that I had the right to seek justice, that maybe holding them accountable would be part of my healing. I resisted for a long time because the thought of facing them again terrified me. I had spent 3 years building a life without them, trying to move forward, trying to forget. The idea of dragging all of that pain back into the light, of putting myself in their orbit again, made me feel physically sick. But something had changed in me during those years away. I had started to discover who I was without their constant criticism and control. I had started to believe that maybe I did deserve better, that what they did was genuinely wrong, and that they shouldn't be allowed to just move on with their perfect public lives while I struggled with the aftermath of their cruelty. I started having dreams about confronting them, about making them acknowledge what they had done, about hearing them admit that I wasn't the problem, that they were. Those dreams became more frequent, more vivid, until I couldn't ignore them anymore. So I made an appointment with a lawyer who specialized in family law and abuse cases. Her name was Margaret Chen, and she was in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. I sat in her office, which was cluttered with case files and legal books, and I told her everything. I brought my journal, years of documented abuse written in my teenage handwriting, and I watched her face as she read through it. She didn't interrupt, didn't judge, just listened and took notes. When I finished, she looked at me for a long moment, and I could see something like anger in her eyes, but it wasn't directed at me. It was directed at them, at what they had done. She told me honestly that it would be difficult, that cases like mine were notoriously hard to prove, especially when the abuse was primarily emotional and psychological, when the physical evidence had long since healed, when it was essentially my word against theirs. She told me it would be expensive, emotionally draining, and there were no guarantees of success. She also told me that if I wanted to do this, she would help me, and that she believed me. Those 3 words, "I believe you," hit me like a physical force. I started crying right there in her office, ugly crying, the kind where you can't catch your breath and your face gets all blotchy and your nose runs. She handed me tissues and waited patiently until I could compose myself. I decided right then that I was going to do it. I was going to take them to court. I was going to make them face what they had done. The process of building the case was grueling. We spent months gathering evidence, documenting everything, finding witnesses who could corroborate at least parts of my story. There weren't many. My family had been careful to maintain their image, and most people who knew us believed their version of events. But Margaret was thorough and relentless. She found medical records that showed suspicious injuries, school counselor notes that indicated concerns, neighbors who remembered seeing me locked out of the house. Piece by piece, we built a case that we hoped would be strong enough to stand up in court. I had to relive everything in excruciating detail, had to write statements and give depositions, had to face their lawyers who tried to paint me as a troubled, vindictive daughter making up stories for attention or money. That part was almost worse than the original abuse, because they were so skilled at twisting things, at making me doubt myself, at making everything sound reasonable and justified from their perspective. They portrayed themselves as loving parents who had tried their best with a difficult child, who were heartbroken by these false accusations, who were the real victims here. I had moments where I wanted to give up, where the fight seemed too hard and the outcome too uncertain. But Margaret kept reminding me why we were doing this, what was at stake, and somehow I found the strength to keep going. The day the trial began, I barely slept the night before. I stood in front of my tiny bathroom mirror, practicing what I would say, trying to steady my voice, trying to look confident and credible. I chose my outfit carefully, professional but not too formal. Nothing that would make me look like I was trying too hard or like I had something to hide. I wanted to look like what I was, a survivor trying to tell the truth. Walking into that courtroom was one of the hardest things I've ever done. The building itself was intimidating, all marble and dark wood and official-looking people in suits hurrying past with briefcases and serious expressions. Margaret met me at the entrance and walked me through what would happen, but her words seemed to come from very far away, filtered through the rushing sound in my ears and the pounding of my heart. When I finally took my seat and saw them across the aisle, my family all together, presenting a united front, I felt that old familiar fear trying to crawl back into my bones. My mother's expression was perfectly calibrated, hurt, confused, betrayed by a daughter she had loved and sacrificed for. My father looked stern and disappointed, as if I were a disobedient child being punished for misbehavior. My brother still wouldn't look at me, his face carefully neutral. They were good at this, I realized. They had been perfecting these masks their entire lives. The first few days of the trial were excruciating. I had to testify, had to sit on that stand with everyone watching me, with them watching me, and recount the worst moments of my life. I had to describe in detail the emotional abuse, the physical violence, the isolation, the control. I had to answer questions from their lawyers designed to trip me up, to make me look unreliable or vindictive. They asked about my mental health, my struggles after leaving home, my financial situation, implying that I was doing this for money, that I was unstable, that I couldn't be trusted. I wanted to scream at them that of course I had mental health issues. Look at what was done to me. Of course I struggled. They had sent me into the world with nothing and told me I would fail. But I stayed calm, answered the questions as honestly as I could, and trusted that the truth would be enough. Margaret put on expert witnesses, psychologists who explained trauma and abuse patterns, who validated that my symptoms and experiences were consistent with someone who had endured prolonged childhood abuse. She showed the journal entries, played recordings I didn't even remember making on my old phone, presented the medical records and witness statements. It was all there, laid out in black and white, a chronicle of cruelty that should have been undeniable. But they had their own experts, their own witnesses, friends and colleagues who testified to what wonderful people they were, how active they were in the community, how devoted they seemed to their children. People who had only ever seen the mask, never what was underneath. It became clear that this could go either way, that the judge would have to decide whose version of reality to believe, and that terrified me. Then came the moment that changed everything, the moment I will remember for the rest of my life. It was the 4th day of the trial, and my father was on the stand. He had been testifying about what a devoted parent he had been, how he had provided for our family, how he had tried to instill good values and discipline in his children. He was confident, articulate, convincing. He denied everything, called my accusations lies, said he had no idea why I would make up such terrible stories about them. He spoke about how painful it was to be falsely accused by his own daughter, how it had damaged his reputation, his business relationships, his standing in the community. He was playing the victim perfectly, and I could see some people in the courtroom being swayed by his performance. Margaret had been quiet during most of his testimony, letting him talk, letting him build his story, but I could see her taking notes, her pen moving rapidly across her yellow legal pad, and there was something about her posture, a kind of coiled energy, that told me she was preparing for something. When it was her turn to cross-examine him, she stood up slowly, gathered her notes, and approached the witness stand with a calm, measured stride. She asked him a few preliminary questions, establishing timelines and facts, nothing too aggressive. He answered smoothly, still confident, still in control. Then she asked him about discipline, about how he had handled misbehavior when I was growing up. He launched into a speech about the importance of structure and consequences, about teaching children responsibility, about how modern parenting was too permissive and that's why so many young people today were entitled and disrespectful. He was getting comfortable, pontificating, enjoying the sound of his own voice, and that's when Margaret struck. She stopped walking, stood perfectly still, looked him directly in the eyes, and asked in a clear, calm voice that somehow carried to every corner of that courtroom, "Mr. Harrison, if your methods of discipline were appropriate and your daughter is lying about abuse, can you explain to this court why you paid her high school counselor $5,000 3 months before she graduated to delete her file and not report the bruises she had documented?" The silence that followed that question was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop in that courtroom. I watched my father's face, saw the blood drain from it, saw his confidence crack and crumble in real time. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at his lawyer, at my mother, back at Margaret, and I saw something I had never seen before in my father's eyes. Pure panic. His lawyer was shouting objections, demanding to know where this information came from. But Margaret calmly presented bank records showing the wire transfer, a statement from the counselor who had finally come forward after carrying the guilt for years, documentation that proved my father had actively worked to hide evidence of abuse. The judge ordered silence and told my father to answer the question. I watched him struggle, saw him trying to find a way out, a plausible explanation, anything that would save him. But there was nothing. The evidence was irrefutable. He had paid to cover up abuse, which meant he knew there was abuse to cover up, which meant everything he had just testified to was a lie. I was just trying to protect her, he finally stammered, and even as the words left his mouth, I could see him realize his mistake. Protect her from what? Margaret asked immediately, her voice still calm, but with an edge of steel now. If there was nothing wrong, if your home was safe and loving as you claim, what exactly were you protecting her from? He couldn't answer. He sat there, this man who had terrified me my entire childhood, this man who had controlled every aspect of my life, who had made me believe I was worthless and broken, and he had no answer. The mask had finally, completely slipped, and everyone in that courtroom could see what was underneath. What happened next happened quickly. Margaret presented more evidence that their lawyer hadn't known about. Evidence of other payoffs, other cover-ups, a pattern of behavior that showed this wasn't a one-time thing, that my parents had systematically worked to hide what they were doing. My mother's perfect composure cracked. She started crying, but these weren't the calculated tears she had been using throughout the trial. These were real tears of fear, of someone watching their carefully constructed world collapse. My brother put his head in his hands, and my father, the man who had seemed so untouchable, so powerful, just sat there with his head down, unable to maintain eye contact with anyone. The judge called a recess, and when we reconvened an hour later, something had shifted. My parents' lawyer requested a meeting with Margaret, and after a tense negotiation in a side room that I wasn't allowed in, they came back with an offer. They would settle, admitting to a pattern of physical and emotional abuse, agreeing to a financial settlement, agreeing to a formal apology read in open court, agreeing to stay away from me permanently. It wasn't everything. It wasn't a criminal conviction. They wouldn't go to jail. But it was an admission. It was them acknowledging, in a legal and public way, that they had hurt me, that I had been telling the truth, that I wasn't crazy or vindictive or making things up. Margaret looked at me, letting me make the decision. I thought about it for a long moment, about what I wanted, what I needed. Part of me wanted to keep fighting, wanted a complete victory, wanted them to suffer the way they had made me suffer. But another part of me, the part that was tired and traumatized and just wanted to heal, knew that this was enough. This was acknowledgement. This was validation. This was them finally being forced to face what they had done. I nodded, and Margaret told them we accepted. The moment they read that apology in court, with my father's voice shaking and my mother unable to look at me, with my brother sitting there witnessing his parents admit to abuse he had watched and done nothing about, something inside me shifted. It wasn't instant healing. Trauma doesn't work like that. But it was the beginning of something. It was closure in a way I hadn't known I needed. They admitted it. After years of gaslighting, of making me doubt my own reality, of telling me I was the problem, they stood in a court of law and admitted that they had abused me. Every day since that trial, I've had to work on healing. It's not a linear process. There are good days and bad days. Days when I feel strong and capable, and days when I'm right back in that little girl's body, terrified and alone. Therapy has been crucial, helping me unpack all the damage, helping me learn what healthy relationships look like, helping me understand that I am not defined by what they did to me. I've had to learn how to trust people, how to accept love without waiting for the other shoe to drop, how to believe that I'm worthy of good things. It's hard work, the hardest work I've ever done, but it's worth it. I've built a life I'm proud of now. I finished my degree, found a career that fulfills me, created a chosen family of friends who love and support me. I've even started dating, which is terrifying in its own way because intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability was weaponized against me for so long. But I'm trying. Every day I'm trying to move forward, to not let what they did define the rest of my life. The settlement money helped. I was able to pay off debts, get better mental health care, have some financial stability for the first time in my adult life. But more important than the money was the acknowledgement, the validation, the public record that says I was telling the truth. I still have nightmares sometimes, still have moments when I see someone who looks like my father, or hear a voice similar to my mother's, and my body goes into full panic mode. I still struggle with feeling like I have to be perfect to be worthy of love, with anxiety that spikes at unexpected moments, with trusting my own judgment because they spent so many years making me doubt it. But I also have hope now, something I didn't have for most of my life. I have proof that the truth matters, that standing up for yourself matters, that you don't have to accept abuse just because it comes from family. I've become an advocate in my own small way, sharing my story when it feels safe to do so, supporting others who are going through similar situations, volunteering with organizations that help abuse survivors. I've learned that my pain can have purpose, that surviving can become thriving if you're willing to do the work. One of the most important things I've learned through all of this is that family doesn't have to be the people you're born to. Family can be the people you choose, the people who show up for you, who support you, who love you without conditions or expectations of perfection. The friends who sat with me during the trial, who held me when I cried, who celebrated with me when we won, who continue to be there for me years later, they're my real family. The therapist who believed me when I felt like no one else would. The lawyer who fought for me when I didn't know how to fight for myself. The support group members who understand because they've lived through similar horrors, they're my family. I've built something beautiful out of the ashes of that terrible childhood, and that's something my biological family can never take away from me. I want to talk for a moment about that question. That one question Margaret asked that changed everything. The brilliance of it wasn't just in the information it revealed, though that was crucial, but in the way it trapped my father in his own lies. He had been so confident, so sure, that he could control the narrative the way he had always controlled everything in his life. But that question, coming out of nowhere, based on evidence he didn't know existed, shattered his composure completely. It showed everyone watching that he knew there was something to hide, that he had actively worked to cover up evidence of abuse, which meant he knew the abuse was happening and was real. It was a masterstroke of legal strategy, but more than that, it was justice finally catching up to someone who had thought himself untouchable. Margaret told me later that she had been saving that information, waiting for exactly the right moment to deploy it. She knew my father would be arrogant enough to testify, confident enough in his own performance to think he could convince everyone. She let him commit fully to his lie before she exposed it, making it impossible for him to walk it back or explain it away. I'm forever grateful to her for that, for believing in my case enough to put in that kind of strategic thinking and effort. Have you ever had a moment where everything you thought about yourself, about your past, gets suddenly reframed? Where lies you believed for years are revealed as lies, and truth you always knew deep down but were afraid to acknowledge becomes undeniable. That's what that moment was for me. Watching my father fall apart on the stand, hearing him inadvertently admit to abuse he had just denied, seeing my mother's perfect facade crumble, it was like watching a magic trick being revealed, seeing that the monster who had haunted my nightmares was just a person, flawed and frightened and capable of being held accountable. I can't say that I've forgiven them because I'm not sure that I have or that I need to. Forgiveness is complicated, and I think sometimes we pressure survivors to forgive as if that's the only path to healing. But I've learned that healing can happen without forgiveness. I've learned to let go of the anger enough that it doesn't poison my daily life. I've learned to understand that hurt people, and they probably had their own traumas that contributed to how they treated me. But I don't have to forgive them or have them in my life to move forward. What I needed was acknowledgement, which I got, and the freedom to build a life without them, which I have. Some days that feels like enough, and other days I'm still angry about the childhood I should have had, the innocence that was stolen from me, the years I spent believing I was fundamentally unlovable and broken. Both things can be true. I can be healing and still be angry. I can be moving forward and still grieve what I lost. The trial was 3 years ago now, and I haven't seen or spoken to any of them since that day in court. The settlement included a restraining order at my request, which means they're not allowed to contact me or come near me. As far as I know, they still live in that perfect house in that perfect neighborhood, still maintain some version of their public image, though I'm sure the trial damaged it significantly. I don't know if they've changed, if they've reflected on what they did, if they feel genuine remorse or just embarrassment at being caught. Honestly, I don't need to know. They're no longer central to my story. They're part of my past, part of what shaped me, but they don't define my present or my future. I define those now, and that's a power I never thought I would have. If you're reading this, if any part of my story resonates with you, please know that you're not alone. Abuse thrives in silence and isolation, and breaking that silence is terrifying but necessary. I know how hard it is to speak up, especially against family, especially when everyone around you believes the lie instead of the truth. I know how exhausting it is to fight, how many times you'll want to give up, how scary it is to face your abusers and demand accountability. But I also know it's possible. I know that there are people who will believe you, who will fight for you, who will help you find justice and healing. I know that the truth matters even when it's hard, even when it feels like no one wants to hear it. I know that you deserve better than abuse, that you deserve love and safety and the chance to become whoever you're meant to be without someone else's cruelty holding you back. Please don't give up. Please keep fighting. Please know that your story matters, that you matter, and that there is life and hope and healing on the other side of this darkness. It won't be easy. I won't lie to you and say it will be, but it's worth it. You're worth it. I'm still learning that myself, still working every day to truly believe it in my bones, but I believe it more now than I ever did when I was trapped in that house, convinced I was worthless. If you're in an abusive situation right now, please reach out for help. Call a hotline, talk to a counselor or teacher, tell someone you trust. Document everything you can safely document. Make a plan for how to leave when you're able to. Know that it's not your fault, that you're not imagining things, that you deserve better. And if you're out, if you've already escaped but are struggling with the aftermath like I was, please be patient with yourself. Healing isn't linear. It doesn't happen on anyone else's timeline. And there's no shame in needing help or taking years to work through trauma. Every step forward is a victory, even when it feels impossibly small. Every day you survive is evidence of your strength, even when you don't feel strong. You're not broken or damaged beyond repair. You're a survivor, and that's something to be proud of. So let me ask you, have you or someone you know experienced something similar? Have you felt trapped by people who were supposed to love you? Have you struggled to make others believe what you've lived through? I want to hear from you in the comments below. Your story matters, your voice matters, and sometimes just sharing your experience and having it acknowledged by others can be an important part of healing. Please take a moment to comment, to share your thoughts, to connect with others in this community who understand. If this story touched you in any way, if it resonated with your own experiences or helped you understand something you've been through or witnessed, please do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps more people find this story, more survivors find this community, and it lets me know that sharing my truth, as painful and vulnerable as it is making a difference. And please, if you want to hear more stories like this, real stories from real people about survival and resilience and finding hope in the darkest places, subscribe to my Truth Revealed Tales. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we share a new story, a new perspective, a new testament to the human spirit's incredible capacity to heal and grow. This community we're building here is so important. It's a place where truth is honored, where survivors are believed, where we can all support each other in our journeys toward healing. Thank you for listening to my story, for witnessing my truth, for being part of this community. Thank you for caring enough to read this far, for opening your heart to the pain and the hope in these words. You have no idea how much it means to be heard, to be believed, to have my experience validated by others. For so many years I was silenced, and now I get to speak, and people actually listen. That's a gift I never take for granted. I hope my story gave you something. Maybe hope if you needed it. Maybe validation if you've been through something similar. Maybe just a reminder that truth and justice do sometimes prevail even when it seems impossible. Whatever you take from this, I hope it serves you well. And I hope you know that wherever you are in your own journey, whatever you're facing, you're not alone. There's a whole community here of survivors and allies who understand, who care, who are cheering for your healing and happiness. Keep fighting. Keep healing. Keep moving forward. You're worth it, and your truth matters. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And please share your story in the comments. I read every single one, and your words matter more than you know.